Let me tell you what nobody in the mainstream Western media wants to say out loud. The war in Ukraine is not going the way Washington thinks it is. And the reason nobody wants to say this is because the people who are supposed to be telling you the truth, the analysts, the journalists, the policy establishment, are operating inside a narrative. And when you're inside a narrative, the most dangerous thing you can do is question it. You lose your access, you lose your credibility, you lose your invitations to the important conferences. So the narrative continues, and the gap between what is actually happening and what is being reported keeps widening. Until one day, reality intervenes. And reality, when it finally does intervene, is not gentle. So today I want to close that gap. I want to walk you through what is actually happening in Ukraine, what is happening inside the mind of Moscow, what the West thinks it is doing with its drone strategy, and why I believe this entire trajectory leads somewhere that most comfortable people in Washington and Brussels have not seriously contemplated. Let's start with the battlefield, because this is where the first and most important lie is being told. If you read the mainstream Western press right now, you are being told that the tide has turned. You are being told that Ukraine is on the march, that Russia is struggling, that the combination of Western weapons, Ukrainian resilience, and especially this new drone campaign targeting deep inside Russian territory has fundamentally shifted the balance. You hear this from commentators, you read it in major newspapers, and you see it reflected in the confident postures of European leaders who talk about ramping up military production. Now, here's the problem. If you actually look at what is happening on the ground, and I mean really look, not read the headlines, but study the maps, study the casualty figures, study the territorial movement, the picture is completely different. Russia is winning on the battlefield. Slowly, yes. Painfully, yes. At great cost, absolutely. But winning. The Russians are systematically moving through the Donbass. They have already consolidated their control over Luhansk. And by the end of this summer, perhaps into the early autumn, they are very likely to complete their control over Donetsk as well. There is no Ukrainian counteroffensive that is reversing this. There is no evidence, none, that the Ukrainians have turned the tide on the ground. So then you have to ask yourself, if the narrative of Ukrainian success on the battlefield is false, what is it hiding? What it is hiding is this. Because the West cannot win the ground war for Ukraine, it has pivoted to a different strategy. And this strategy is the drone campaign. The idea is not to win on the battlefield. The idea is to inflict so much economic and psychological pain deep inside Russia, targeting energy infrastructure, military production facilities, cities that ordinary Russians live in, including Moscow and St. Petersburg, that Russia eventually cracks at the negotiating table and agrees to terms favorable to Ukraine and the West. Now, I want you to think carefully about this strategy, because it is based on an assumption. And the assumption is this, that Russia has a breaking point, that if you hit it hard enough, repeatedly enough, in places that feel close to home, Russia will eventually hold up its hands and say, enough, let's make a deal. This assumption has a name in strategic theory. It is called coercive bombing. And the historical record of coercive bombing is, to put it politely, not encouraging. The British bombed German cities for years. The Americans bombed North Vietnam for years. Israel has bombed Gaza with extraordinary intensity. Did any of these campaigns cause the target to capitulate at the negotiating table on the attacker's terms? No. What coercive bombing tends to do, historically, is harden the target's resolve while allowing the leadership of the targeted country to rally its population around a narrative of external aggression and national survival. But the West is betting that this time will be different. Why? Because of technology, because drones are cheap, because Ukraine can build them in large numbers, and the West, Europe in particular, can help Ukraine scale up production to a level that makes the drone campaign not a nuisance, but a genuine strategic weapon. The argument being made is that drones are the great equalizer, that you don't need a massive land army or an expensive air force. You just need patience, industrial capacity, and intelligence support. And with all three, you can reach into the Russian heartland and make Russia bleed. Now let me explain why Moscow reads this situation very differently from Washington and Brussels. From Moscow's perspective, and this is critical to understand if you want to predict what happens next, this is not a proxy war anymore. This was always, in Putin's framing, a conflict provoked by Western expansion. But for years, even accepting that framing, there was a degree of separation. NATO countries were providing weapons. NATO countries were providing intelligence. NATO countries were providing money. But there was still a fiction that this was Ukraine fighting Russia, with the West in a supporting role. That fiction is now gone. When British Storm Shadow missiles are hitting targets inside Russian territory, missiles that require British satellite intelligence, British targeting data, British operational support, there is no longer any meaningful distinction between quote-unquote Ukrainian strikes and quote-unquote Western strikes. When European leaders announce publicly that Ukraine now produces drones that match or exceed Russian production capacity, and that Europe's task is to accelerate that capacity further, they are not describing a support role. They are describing co-belligerence. And this is exactly how Moscow reads it. Putin has said explicitly that he believes the West is at war with Russia. This is not propaganda for domestic consumption. This is his actual strategic assessment. And his actual strategic assessment matters enormously because it determines how he will respond. Now I want to introduce you to a name that is not well known in Western media, but that is absolutely central to understanding where this conflict may be heading. His name is Sergei Karaganov. He is one of Russia's most senior foreign policy intellectuals. He is not a marginal figure. He has been an advisor to the Kremlin for decades, and for the past 2 years, he has been making a very specific argument. The argument goes like this. Russia has failed to establish credible red lines with the West. Every time Russia has set a limit, this far and no further, the West has stepped across it and nothing has happened. The West has concluded, Karaganov argues, that Russia is bluffing, that Russia will absorb any level of pain and never escalate in a way that would truly threaten Western countries. And because the West has reached this conclusion, the West feels free to keep escalating. More weapons, more intelligence, more drones, targets deeper inside Russia, closer and closer to Moscow itself. Karaganov's prescription, and I want you to really hear this, is that Russia must now disabuse the West of this belief, not by continuing to absorb the attacks, not by more diplomacy, but by striking military targets in European countries. First, with conventional weapons. And if that does not produce the necessary shock, if Europe still does not pull back, then with nuclear weapons. Now, when Karaganov first made this argument early in the war, he was in a clear minority. His colleagues thought he was extreme. They thought he was dangerous. They thought he was miscalculating the Western response. That is no longer the case. By his own account, and by the account of observers who study the Russian foreign policy community closely, the consensus inside Russia has shifted. The Karaganov position, that Russia must demonstrate it has red lines and is willing to enforce them through escalation up to and including nuclear use, is now the mainstream position within the Russian establishment. And here is what should worry you most. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's principal spokesman, not a peripheral figure, the man who speaks for the Kremlin on its most sensitive matters, said recently that Russia's nuclear deterrent is now its only ace in the hole. Think about that framing. Not its army, not its economy, not its diplomacy. Its nuclear deterrent is the only ace in the hole. That is not the language of a country that is planning to negotiate its way to a favorable settlement. That is the language of a country that has looked at its strategic situation and concluded that conventional options are insufficient. Now, the West's response to all of this is essentially, we don't believe them. We think the Russian red lines are not real red lines. We think the Article 5 guarantee of NATO that an attack on one member is an attack on all is a sufficient deterrent. Russia would never strike a European country because it would trigger a NATO response that Russia cannot survive. So Russia will keep absorbing the drone attacks. Russia will keep losing slowly on the battlefield. And eventually, Russia will come to the negotiating table. I want to explain to you why this is a very dangerous assumption to make. The Article 5 guarantee is a political commitment, not a physical fact. Whether NATO actually responds to a Russian conventional strike on, say, a military facility in Poland or Romania, and responds in a way that triggers a full-scale war with a nuclear power, depends on political will, on domestic politics in every NATO country, on the specific circumstances of the strike, on whether Russia claims it was targeting only Western military assets supporting the Ukraine drone campaign, on whether there are casualties among civilians. None of this is automatic. None of this is guaranteed. And Moscow knows it. What Moscow has observed over the past several years is that the West says very strong things and then does somewhat less strong things. The West said there would be catastrophic consequences for the invasion of Ukraine. The consequences were significant. They were not catastrophic for Russia. The West said it would never allow certain weapons to reach Ukraine. Then it allowed them. The West said it would not allow strikes on Russian territory. Then it allowed them. At each stage, the red line moved, and Russia absorbed the move and waited. Now Karaganov is arguing that it is Russia's turn to move the red line. That Russia must demonstrate that Western escalation carries real costs. Costs that land not in Ukraine, but in Europe. Let me be very direct about what I think follows from this analysis. The trajectory of this conflict, if it continues on its current path, leads to one of three outcomes. The first is that the drone campaign somehow breaks Russian political will and Russia agrees to negotiate on Western terms. Based on everything I know about Russian history, Russian political culture, and the specific nature of this conflict, which Russia's leadership genuinely views as existential, I consider this outcome extremely unlikely. Nations fighting for what they perceive as their survival do not capitulate because their cities are being bombed. If anything, it deepens their resolve. The second outcome is a frozen conflict. The fighting grinds on indefinitely. The drone campaign continues. Russia absorbs it. Ukraine is slowly squeezed on the battlefield. And the world learns to live with a low-grade war in Europe that nobody quite knows how to end. This is survivable. It is not a good outcome, but it is survivable. The third outcome, and this is the one that the Western establishment refuses to take seriously, which is exactly why I think it deserves the most serious attention, is that Moscow decides that the costs of absorption have exceeded the costs of escalation, that Russia strikes a military target in Europe, that the carefully maintained fiction of a clear line between the Russia-Ukraine war and a Russia-NATO war collapses. And we are then in territory that no serious strategic thinker in the post-Cold War era has had to navigate. Here is what I find most disturbing about the current moment. The narrative in Western media, the narrative that the drone campaign is working, that Russia is on its back foot, that more pressure will produce diplomatic results, actively prevents the people who consume that narrative from understanding the danger they are in. Because if you believe the narrative, the logical policy conclusion is do more. More drones, more intelligence sharing, more escalation, more pressure, because it is working. And every increment of more pushes Russia further along the path toward the decision that Karaganov is advocating. Now, I want to explain something that I think is genuinely underappreciated about how political decisions are made in situations like this. There is a theory in game theory called the spiral model. The spiral model explains how two parties can each be acting defensively, each genuinely believing they are only responding to the other's aggression, and yet through a sequence of individually rational defensive moves, they end up in a conflict that neither of them wanted and that both of them, at any individual step, could not see coming. Each escalation looks, from the inside, like a measured response to a provocation. From the outside, looking at the whole sequence, it looks like a march toward catastrophe. That is the structure of what is happening in Ukraine right now. The West genuinely believes it is deterring Russia by showing resolve. Russia genuinely believes it is defending its homeland against existential encirclement. Each step each side takes looks to that side like a necessary and proportionate response. The aggregate of all those steps is a trajectory towards something that nobody who is being honest can call safe. And the reason this matters, the reason I am spending time on this when I could be talking about other things, is that the people in the Western foreign policy establishment who are driving this process are not, for the most part, bad people. They are not warmongers. They are not reckless. They are people who are operating inside a framework that tells them, show strength, maintain solidarity with Ukraine, don't give Russia anything for free, and eventually Russia will back down. That framework made sense in certain historical contexts. The problem is that it may not apply to this context where Russia has nuclear weapons and perceives the conflict as existential. I want to say something about the role of domestic politics in all of this, because it is not a secondary factor. It is central. The Trump administration came into office with a genuine interest in ending this war. That was not fake. The question was always, on what terms? And here is where the domestic political economy of the American foreign policy establishment created a gravitational pull toward hawkishness. Inside the American national security community, the career incentives, the social incentives, the reputational incentives all point in one direction. Being tough on Russia is safe. Being soft on Russia, even in the name of ending a war, opens you to the charge of appeasement. And no American politician wants to be Neville Chamberlain. So what you have seen is a gradual drift from we are going to end this war to we are not impartial mediators, we support Ukraine. From there is no military solution to providing the intelligence support that makes the drone campaign possible. Each step is individually defensible. The aggregate is a complete reversal of the original position. And what accelerates this drift? Events elsewhere. When an administration is taking heat on another front, when it is being accused of weakness in negotiations with another adversary, the temptation is to compensate by showing toughness somewhere else. This is not a conspiracy. This is just how political psychology works. You absorb criticism in one place, you demonstrate resolve in another place. And the place where you demonstrate resolve ends up being Ukraine. More support for the drone campaign, more signals to Moscow that the West is committed, which Moscow reads as more evidence that the West is at war with Russia, which pushes the Karaganov logic further along. I want to return, before I close, to something that I think is the deepest issue in all of this, which is the question of what a red line actually is. A red line only functions as a deterrent if both parties believe it is real. If one party believes the other's red lines are bluffs, deterrence breaks down. And right now, the West has decided, based on evidence from the early years of this conflict, that Russia's red lines are not real. That Russia will say certain things will not be tolerated and then tolerate them. And they are not wrong that this has been the pattern. But here is the danger. That pattern was the pattern of a Russia that was still hoping the war would end on terms it could live with without having to resort to the Karaganov strategy. A Russia that was still, at some level, pulling its punches because it believed either that it would win on the battlefield or that some diplomatic off-ramp would emerge. What changes that calculus is cumulative frustration. It is what happens when a country looks at its situation and concludes, we have tried restraint, and it has produced more escalation. We have tried signaling, and the signals have been ignored. We have tried negotiating, and the West's conditions are terms we cannot accept. At that point, the internal debate shifts, and the Karaganov faction, which is no longer a minority, which now includes figures like Medvedev and appears to have the sympathy of Peskov himself, that faction's argument starts to look, from inside Moscow, not like recklessness, but like rationality. I am not telling you that a Russian strike on European soil is inevitable. I am telling you that the people in the Western establishment who say it is impossible are operating on an assumption that Russia will never cross that line, that they have not seriously tested. And assumptions that have not been seriously tested in geopolitics have a way of being tested by reality at the worst possible moment. What would a serious response to this situation look like? I think it would look like this. It would start with an acknowledgement, not public, but internal to the policy process, that the drone campaign is not going to make Russia capitulate, that Russia's political will is not going to break under aerial bombardment, because it never has in the past, and because this is a conflict that Russians across the political spectrum, including many who oppose Putin personally, view as a matter of national survival. Starting from that acknowledgement, it becomes possible to ask a different question. Not how do we increase pressure, but what is an outcome that both sides can live with? That conversation has not happened in any serious way. And it has not happened because the narrative, Russia is failing, the drone campaign is working, more pressure will produce results, does not allow for it. The narrative is, in a very precise sense, preventing the policy adjustment that might avert a much worse outcome. Now, here is the question I want to leave you with, not as a rhetorical device, but as a genuine analytical puzzle. At what point does a power that believes it is fighting for survival, that has a nuclear arsenal, that has exhausted conventional diplomatic options, and that has a rising internal consensus in favor of escalation, at what point does that power decide that the cost of inaction exceeds the cost of action? I do not know the answer. I do not think anyone in the West knows the answer. And that uncertainty, that deep, genuine uncertainty about where the line is itself the most dangerous thing in this entire situation. Because when you do not know where the line is, you cannot calibrate your actions to stay safely below it. You can only keep pushing and hope that the line is further than you think. History does not reward that kind of hope.